Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. Over the weekend, the business world lost one of its larger-than-life characters, Harold Mitchell. Mitchell dominated the ad buying space after founding Mitchell and Partners in 1976. By the time he sold to Aegis Group for hundreds of millions of dollars more than a decade ago, his company was booking 10% of all media advertising in Australia. After selling, he remained a constant presence in the industry, as well as continuing his passion for philanthropy and the arts. He also knew how to generate a headline. One man who saw that firsthand is Damon Kitney, columnist for the Weekend Australian and the author of The Fortune Tellers, the stories of some of Australia's greatest business leaders. Damon, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Thanks, Sean.
Harold Mitchell, you interviewed him a number of times over the years. What was he like in person? Because certainly we heard lots about him for those of us who didn't know him. What was he really like?
Yeah, I would say, Sean, a very enigmatic character and also larger than life. And unfortunately, in Harold's early years, and you can look up the photos, he was literally larger than life. He had a major weight issue during his, media buying supremo days, you would say, and he went very publicly on the record to say that he had gas band surgery, or however you describe that, and he just looked a completely different person. Also, Harold was very public in talking about his battles with alcohol and basically giving it up for good, and he founded a charity which now deals with particularly young people with alcohol issues. So Harold was always very open about his health. As a business person, as they say, he's an advertising legend, probably one of the most gifted people in terms of the gift of the gab that I've ever dealt with. Harold always had an answer for everything, and often would talk verbatim about all that he was doing, and just a consummate deal maker, I guess you would say. If you look at what Harold did over the years and the relationships that he forged, that gift of the gab got him some amazing transactions for his media buying firm, and then that extended into other parts of his life later, where he was on the Crown board for a number of years. He did major, transactions around sport, and with Kerry Stokes at Channel 7, who was one of the first out on Sunday afternoon to Lord Harold. They were very close. So, look, he was just one of a kind. And in terms of me personally, he would always take your phone call, always call you back, even through the most difficult days of Crown. When you were desperate for Harold to call you back, he would always do that. Unfortunately, at those moments, he would not tell you anything, which was also a testament to him. He didn't leak, unlike some others. So he was always very proper, I guess is the word. I know he's been criticised in some circles on that, and had some tangles with regulators, but certainly in my experience, a very proper businessman too.
He was kind of one of the last of a generation of the cult of the CEO. So there were people like Lindsay Fox, there was Harold Mitchell, there was John Singleton's probably another one you can throw into that category. Older gentlemen now, but really built their businesses around themselves. All those three people were owner builders, so to speak, in terms of the business world. Is that still around? I mean, are we seeing that kind of cult of the CEO like we did in the 70s, 80s, 90s? John Elliott, of course, was the great one, the great Melbourne identity on that, but we just don't seem to have that as much anymore.
No, and I think, to be honest, investors have lost patience with the cult of the CEO. And when you do see it now, and a couple of those names you mentioned, they're usually in private business. They're not in public company markets. And I think, obviously there's been some wonderful cult figures as CEOs of public companies over time. You mentioned a few, but I think investors now see through hubris a lot quicker than they did in the past, because there's just so much scrutiny now from every edge through social media and media everywhere of public company CEOs. And I actually find that, there's been an increase too in the public relations industry that surrounds the public markets, which has really sanitised, I think, leadership. And, that sort of cult of personality probably wouldn't survive the public relations scrutiny and regime that's now in place with a lot of these businesses. It's all about, focusing on obviously the shareholders, but also, stakeholders is the bigger question. So that's about bringing in, the community, particularly around the environmental, social and governance issues, famous ESG. So, that's really taken away from, I guess, the concentration on the personality that we saw previously. And that's, at the end of the day, I think if you ask some of the big investors, that's not a bad thing. We all have super in these companies. And I think, the focus on performance, the focus on stakeholders has been to the benefit of us as investors through our super compared to the past. I mean, the last great cult of personality CEO that I dealt with was Wal King, who ran a company called Leighton Holdings. And that was the ultimate cult of personality. Like, Wal...
For good and bad, Damon. For good and bad.
True. And unfortunately, Leighton is no longer with us.
Yeah.
It's now morphed into a company called CIMIC. It's owned by the Spanish. It's still a public company, but, it's majority owned offshore. And unfortunately, and Wal will acknowledge, I think, the cult of personality in that company, the key man risk, basically in the end, was the dismantling of Leighton. And that can be the negative part of the cult of personality story for a CEO.
Stay with me, Damon. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is Damon Kitney, columnist for the Weekend Australian and the author of The Fortune Tellers. What about Alan Joyce at Qantas? Because he's not far off the sort of cultish until the end there. Obviously, it went bad for him, but his predecessor, a guy called Jeff Dixon, very similar. He certainly worked media very well. So in airlines, it seemed to attract people like that, or maybe that's just how they run their business. No, I'm guessing Vanessa Hudson's not going to be like that. But where does Alan Joyce fit into this?
Yeah, I mean, Alan was a bit like Harold Mitchell, an enigma, really, because, famously a gay Irish guy, comes here and takes, probably the biggest brand in the country and, builds it up into a bulletproof, machine, essentially. Then they encounter the COVID pandemic, and obviously, all airlines went through a disastrous period there. At the end of the day, if COVID hadn't have happened, Alan probably would have stepped down earlier. He's always claimed publicly that he, stayed on to see the airline through that period. And unfortunately, like in politics and in sport, you can outlive your days. And unfortunately, I think for Alan, the last period of his reign really turned into one of a bit of hubris. I still am amazed to this day about the share sales transactions that happened, the fact that they were approved. And that was really the beginning of the end for Alan. But look, Sean, I know Alan Joyce pretty well, and I admired amazingly what he built. The resilience he showed, a very charming character, intellectually gifted, built amazing relationships. But unfortunately, there was a streak of Alan. Nothing against him being Irish, but he did have, a bit of a temper sometimes, and
the crack or something like that.
Yeah, and unfortunately, he look. The thing I admire about Alan is he's an emotional guy. That's what helped him build the business. But unfortunately, when things go bad and emotion takes over, you see what happens. So it's he could well be, the last great cult of personality CEO that we see in this country in public markets. Private markets are different; they're still there.
So I'm going to alter that a little bit in public, because we still do have some CEOs. So Greg Goodman running Goodman Group, Richard White running WiseTech Global, but they certainly don't try and find the limelights like some of these other guys. But I'm assuming investors and employees are very keen on Greg Goodman running Goodman Group and Richard White running WiseTech Global.
And you can say the same for Kerry Stokes at Seven West, and the same for Jerry Harvey at Harvey Norman. I mean, you're right. There are still a few in the public markets. Those certainly Jerry Harvey's not shy of publicity, but I think there's research that's been done, Sean, over the years where studies have been done on owner founder led companies, and at the end of the day, they tend to outperform over the longer term, and that's a difference from the Alan Joyce Wal King scenario, because they're executives, not owners and founders. So there's a key difference, I guess, between that sort of owner mindset that you see in players now like Richard White and Greg Goodman, as you said, versus to use the term celebrity CEO. I think that's the key distinction that should be made. But, as the Crown experience has shown with James Packer and the difficulties of that firm, it doesn't always work out for the best, although Packer would very clearly say that he created a lot of shareholder value over his time as the major shareholder of Crown, and that is correct.
As a biographer of Packer, Damon, this segues nicely into your new book, The Fortune Tellers. So the stories of some of Australia's greatest business leaders. In 30 seconds, give us a rundown of what it's about.
30 seconds, gee. Well, look, it's really just a collection, I guess, of the work that I've done in the Weekend Australian and a couple of other outlets over recent years. There are a couple of stories from my further past when I worked with you at the AFR, Sean. But really, it's a story of celebrating stories of success, and that's what the title is. And all these stories are very human stories, many that haven't been told before, of people who have gone through, amazing challenges in their life and have succeeded in business. And I hope, people that buy it will really learn from the stories that are told in the book. And as I said, some of them have only told this story for the only time in the book. So, hopefully people will learn from it.
I look forward to reading it. Damon, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Pleasure, Sean. Thanks.
That was Damon Kitney, columnist for The Weekend Australian and the author of The Fortune Tellers. This is the Fear and Greed Business Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, Australia's best business podcast. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.